Hey everyone, good to see you again. It's me, Jamad Canley. In this segment, we're going to talk about and unpack the word diversity. So we want you really thinking about what does diversity actually mean? And so often when we think about the word diversity, it's difficult for people to describe it without using the word diversity. So when we say diversity, we're talking about uniqueness, we're talking about the mix, we're talking about all the things that make us who we are. So we're going to take a look at diversity from a couple of different perspectives in this segment. And we're going to start off in doing that by using something that we call the diversity wheel. So the diversity wheel is on the screen. And as we take a look at the diversity wheel, you will see some elements of diversity. Now, I'll be fully transparent and tell you, I have never found an image that represents all the diversity that exists in the world. So these are just some elements. Inside the wheel, you have things like race, age, gender, national origin. Outside of the wheel, you have things like political beliefs, family structure, religion, income. These are just some elements of diversity again. But what I would love for you to do is take a moment and, as the prompt says on the screen, just take some time to review the will and think about where and how you show up in each of these different areas. So where are you when it comes to age? Where are you when it comes to race and ethnicity? Where are you when it comes to sexual orientation, education, language and communication skills, appearance, so on and so forth? Take a moment to just review that, process that. Excellent. Thank you. Now, utilizing the same image, we're going to put a few different questions up for us to think about. So, as we look at the diversity wheel, this time, I want you to think about what areas on this wheel do you find yourself not having to think much about? Again, what areas on the wheel do you find yourself not having to think much about? For myself, I'll give you a few examples. Because the key to this question is not having to think much about. It doesn't mean that we never think about it, and it doesn't mean that we sometimes don't have to think about it. But in the big scheme of our lives, in the big picture of our lives, we realize we don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. So here's a couple for me. National origin, for example, I don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it, especially as long as I'm in the US. Being a US citizen, I don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about my national origin. Now, does it mean that I never think about it? Of course I do. I think about it on Veterans Day, 4th of July, Memorial Day, 9/11. I think about it other times throughout the year. I think about it when we have tensions with other countries. I think about it anytime that I see a person in uniform. But I also recognize I don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. I also think about it when I travel abroad. So when I'm in a foreign country, it's very top of mind for me. I'm thinking about the fact that I am an American citizen all the time. I make sure to keep my passport close to me in my inside pocket, right? I'm thinking about, what do I need to do to make sure that I make it back through customs and back onto American soil? It's very top of mind for me. But in the 40 plus years of living, I can tell you it's not something that I think about every day. Sometimes it's not something I even think about once a week. It's kind of like being an air breather, right? Meaning, as humans, we all breathe oxygen, we breathe air. We don't wake up every morning going, oh, man, I'm an air breather. But when we hop in that swimming pool or we hop in that lake, it's top of mind. We're very aware at that moment. But we don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about that. Same thing goes for gender for me. Do I think about gender? Absolutely. I lead diversity, equity, inclusion work all over the country. And because I choose to do this work, I choose to think about many of these different areas. Do I have to sometimes think about my gender? Absolutely. Definitely. When I'm thinking about how I show up and when I can show up as an ally and making sure that, again, I'm being aware of my position. Do I have to spend a lot of time thinking about my gender? No. Sexual orientation is another one for me. Do I have to spend a lot of time thinking about it? Definitely not. Being heterosexual, it's not something I have to spend a lot of time thinking about. When I walk out of a restaurant and I grab my wife's hand, I don't have to think about that. So now that I've given you some examples, take a moment and just process what areas on the wheel do you find yourself not having to think much about? For some of us, we might not have to think about anything on the wheel. We might choose to at times, but we might realize we don't have to think about anything at all on the wheel. For others, maybe we don't have to think about most things on the wheel. But just take a moment and actually write it down. What are some of the areas, not some, what are the areas on this wheel that you find yourself not having to think much about? Excellent. Thank you. Now I would have you to move to the next question. That is, what areas on the wheel do you find yourself having to navigate societal norms, if any? I'll share one for you, for myself. The truth is, there aren't many things on this wheel that I find myself having to spend time thinking about. I don't have to think about many things on this wheel. I don't have to think about most things on this wheel. But one area that I do find myself having to navigate societal norms is race. And I know some people might think like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean? Yeah, I think about race too. Mm, maybe you do. I know some people definitely do. And I realize that some people may think about race sometimes. Some people may have to think about race every now and then. I find myself having to navigate race pretty consistently throughout my life. Examples. When I first moved into this neighborhood that I live in now, we moved in the middle of COVID. And so I don't know a lot of my neighbors, social distancing, all of those different things. In my previous neighborhood, I was the president of the Homeowners Association. I lived there for 14 years, knew just about everyone on our street, in our community, in our development. New community, don't know many people, know my neighbors to my left, neighbors to my right, neighbors behind me. That's pretty much it. See neighbors occasionally while they're out mowing lawns or as people drive by, and people are pretty friendly. I've also realized that there's not a lot of people in this community who look like me. So here's the point of my story. Prior to moving here, I would often go for runs or walks early in the morning or late at night. Helps me clear my head. I normally start my days pretty early. I start work about 6 a.m. doing workshops. And so, get up at 4:30, go for a walk or a run, me and my dog, Mufasa. Well, by the time that we moved here, Mufasa had gotten pretty old, 14, and had developed arthritis. So couldn't go for walks and runs anymore. As a result, I also chose to not go for walks or runs in my new neighborhood early in the morning or late at night because I wasn't sure if simply based off of the color of my skin, I might be perceived as being suspicious. These are things that I have to think about. Going for a run in my neighborhood where there aren't really any people who look like me, where I haven't had an opportunity to meet neighbors, when I'm going for a run, normally wearing, a hooded sweatshirt because it's cold out and it's 4:30 in the morning and it's still dark out, without having a dog on the leash, I could be perceived as being suspicious. I shared that with my neighbor and he said, you're so right. And he said, and that's something I would never even have to think about. So when we say, what areas on the wheel do you find yourself having to navigate societal norms? That's an example. So now I want to give you a moment just to process for yourself. Are there any areas on this wheel that you find yourself having to navigate societal norms, if any? People have often shared, for some people, it's gender. For some people, it's political belief. For others, it's their family structure. What might it be for you? Thank you. Now, as we go back and we think about those areas on the wheel where we have to navigate societal norms, I also want to take you back to the first question about what areas do you not have to think about much? Because now we're going to unpack a very important concept and topic. And I want us to recognize that those areas on the wheel where that we find ourselves not having to navigate, well, those areas are the areas that we are often experiencing privilege. And I know what you're probably thinking. Wow, here we go. I know that privilege can be a pretty heavy term. Privilege can bring up a lot of feelings and emotions for people. Please remember the both and lenses of responsible, not my fault. Also remember individual and group as we talk about this and unpack privilege. So those areas on the wheel that I find myself not having to spend much time thinking about, again, those are areas where I'm experiencing privilege. And what does privilege really mean? Well, privilege isn't so much what you have, but what you don't have to think about or negotiate. And it does not mean that someone's life was made easy, but it does mean that this factor did not make life more difficult. Often people have thought and been made to feel that they need to feel guilty or blamed or shamed about having privilege. And the truth is, you don't. Privilege does not make someone a good person or bad person. It just simply means that, again, this is an area that you don't have to think about or negotiate. Privilege also does not mean that someone who is experiencing privilege has come from a privileged background. Again, doesn't mean that you've had life handed to you. Privilege simply means, again, that this factor did not make life more difficult. So let's go back to the will for a moment. I shared earlier about gender. I experience male privilege. There are things that I just don't have to think about. For example, some of my female consultants, when we travel, I've watched them as we've checked into hotels late at night, and the person working the front desk will say, Mr. Canley, you're in room 727, and Mrs. So-and-so, you're in room 929, and Mr. So-and-so, you're in room 1011. And I've watched my female consultants hand the key back and say, please give me another room. And this time, don't announce my room number out loud. Please just write it on the key. I've never had to think about that. I've watched as we've gotten onto the elevator and they watch who else is on the elevator and they have to watch who else is getting off on the floor that they're getting off at 11 o'clock at night. I don't have to think about those things. Our accountant at one point in time said, Jamad, it makes sense for you and the group to stop renting cars. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, you know, you're spending so much money renting cars, but the truth is you hardly drive when you're traveling. You get in late at night, you go straight to the hotel, you rest up, you go to your destination the next day, which is normally close to the hotel, you do your workshop, and then you're back to the airport and you fly home, but you rented a car, and so on average, we're spending at least $200 with airport fees and all these other concession fees and everything else. He said it makes more sense just to use rideshare. So we can save a lot of money. I'm a small business owner. It sounds really good to me anytime someone says you can save a lot of money. But I also recognize all dollars saved are not always worth it. So I throw this idea out to the group. And most of the consultants say, yeah, that sounds good, Jamal. We're for it. It doesn't matter to us. But two of our female consultants said, and I'm so glad they did, and they spoke up. They said, Jamad, we recognize that when you land in a city late at night, 11 o'clock, midnight, the last thing that many of you want to do is to spend an extra hour of your time catching a shuttle to the rental car lot, working with the people at the rental car place, having to drive, pick the rental car, drive it to the hotel. And then on our return, you have to make sure that you stop off at the gas station, fill up the car, drive it back to the rental car lot, catch a shuttle. We get it. They said, but when we land in strange cities late at night, sometimes the last thing that we want to do is hop into the back seat of a stranger's car. I never had to think about that. That's part of male privilege. Heterosexual privilege, I also experienced. I was doing a workshop once and someone said, Jamad, I love the pictures that you have behind you. And I hadn't even thought about it. I had some pictures of me and my wife and my family hanging on the wall behind me. And then they sent me a private message in the chat and they said, I really admire the fact that you're able to display those pictures. And I said, well, thank you. And I said, what do you mean you admire that? Like, what do you mean by that? And they said, well, I don't know that I'd ever be able to display pictures of me and my partner because I don't know how people would react. I never even had to think twice about displaying pictures of my family because I experienced heterosexual privilege. I experienced able-bodied privilege. I experienced many, many privileges on this wheel. And guess what? That also doesn't make me a bad person. It just means that these are areas that I don't really have to think about. And it doesn't mean that my life was made easy. Believe me. What it does mean, though, is that these factors did not contribute to my difficulties. So in closing, I'll share one short story with you because I really want to tackle sometimes the elephant that's in the room around racial privilege, also referred to as white privilege. One of my best friends, known her since we were both 11 years old, is a white woman. Grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same middle school, went to the same high school. Again, one of my best friends in life. I wouldn't exchange my childhood for hers for even 5 minutes. Wouldn't do it. Though growing up in my city during the time that I grew up, it was tough. It was difficult. It was violent at times. In my home, I never had to worry. I grew up with two amazing, loving parents who are still amazing, loving parents and also amazing, loving grandparents now. I lived in the house that all of my friends wanted to hang out at. My parents are the parents that all of my friends still to this day refer to as mom and dad. I have friends who go by my parents' house just to see my parents, right? Like, I haven't lived there in 20 years and they still go by just to spend time and hang out with my parents. That's the type of home that I grew up in. It was safe. I was supported. I was told constantly that I could do and become anything that I wanted. I was pushed to do the best that I could, and I was told to choose happiness. It's not the way that my friend grew up. She grew up in a home where divorce happened. Addiction was very present on both sides. A mom who was addicted to alcohol, a dad who also had his addictions and battles. She and her younger sisters bounced back and forth between the homes and dealt with many difficulties. Times where they would come home and the lights would be shut off, times where they would be evicted and the locks would be changed, times when dad just wouldn't come home for days on end, times when they didn't have food in the refrigerator, and other things that I won't go into that are way worse in abuses in both homes. Times when we were in high school and I would watch her shove ketchup packets in her pocket so that she and her sisters had snacks later on. Times when they would ride the city bus until they couldn't ride it anymore because it was safer to be on the city bus than it was to go into one of their homes. Times when myself and other friends would bring our lunches to school to give to her so that she could help feed her younger siblings. Her life wasn't easy at all. Fast forward, I go off to WSU. She chooses a different college. She picks a college where, she can go and she can actually move her younger siblings in with her. So while I'm struggling to get up and go to class because I hung out a little bit too late the night before, she's getting up every morning, getting her two younger sisters ready, dropping them off at school before attending class. Speed forward. A couple years ago, maybe about 5 years ago, we're out at dinner. We're all very close, she and her husband, my wife and I. And she says to us, "You won't believe what someone said to me today at work." Everyone says, "What?" She says, "Someone said that I have white privilege." Instantly, everyone gets quiet. She looks at me and says, "Jamad, you do this work. What do you have to say about that?" And I pause for a moment to think to myself, do I want to just enjoy my meal or do I want to engage in this conversation? And before I could even speak, she looked at me and said, "How dare you even consider that?" And I said, "Well, hold on." She said, No. How dare you? You know how I grew up. You know how rough I had it. You know what I experienced. How dare you even consider and even pause to think about whether that statement could be true for me? I didn't grow up privileged. And we engaged in a very difficult conversation. And I shared with her the definitions that I just shared with you. And I explained that though her life was not easy by any means, as I said, I wouldn't exchange my childhood for hers for even 5 minutes. I explained to her many challenges that she had to overcome. And yet, race was not one of those. Race did not contribute to her difficulties. Age did. Being a child and having to navigate that, definitely. Did gender? Absolutely. Some of the things that she and her sisters experienced, definitely. Income? Absolutely. Being evicted, lights being cut off, all of those things. And other things, family structure, other things that are on this wheel definitely contributed. Race just wasn't one of those. And at the end of the conversation, after tears had been shed, she said to me, "I've never had it explained that way before." Anytime I would hear someone use that phrase of privilege, it would just cause me to be defensive. I would get so angry because I know how hard it was for me growing up. And I would just feel like people were saying that, I should feel bad or I was guilty or that I had it easy. And I would think and say to them, "You have no idea what I went through." And all of that for her is true. And yet, race did not contribute to her hardships. Privilege doesn't mean that you had it easy. Privilege doesn't mean that you should feel guilty, and privilege doesn't mean that you should feel bad. Privilege simply means some things that we just didn't have to negotiate or think about. Privilege means that this factor did not make life more difficult. So as you continue to move through the rest of this program and this section on diversity, again, think about diversity from the holistic perspective, but also know that a key element that often comes up is, well, if we're talking about all this diversity, why are we having conversations about race? And I'll leave it right here. Out of all the things that you see on this wheel, race has the largest impact on life outcomes. Does it mean that the other areas aren't important? Of course not. That's not what we're saying at all. These other areas are definitely important. And for the individual, again, it can definitely have large impacts on their lives. When we talk about this collectively and holistically, we recognize that, again, race has the largest impact on life outcomes. It doesn't mean that it's the only topic that should be discussed. And as you go through this and we talk about diversity, again, we're going to talk about it from many different places. But also understand one of the reasons why we talk about racial equity is because it truly has the largest impact on life outcomes. And remember this last thing. We all experience different types of privilege, even at some different times in life. Even if it's just simply able-bodied privilege or age privilege when we reach a certain age. No one needs to feel guilty about their privileges. The question really becomes, how do we use our privilege honorably to create more equity for those who are experiencing discrimination or barriers? I'll see you later. Thank you.